Ladies and gentlemen, it's a sadness to me to interrupt your wonderful conversations, although a pleasure that you're having those wonderful conversations. I want to reflect for a moment that when I was a little boy, I imagined that the senior politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, the leaders of the free world, had achieved their status somehow because of their enormous accomplishment and their towering intellects. That assumption has been challenged recently. However, as I look around for comfort, I find it here and there, or more specifically here, sitting beside me. Rory Stewart, as you all know, is a minister in the British government. But he's been many other things. He's been the sort of things that one imagined in that bygone day that our leaders might actually be. He's been a soldier, he's been a diplomat, he's been an explorer, an adventurer, he's been a scholar and an intellectual. He's lived with the Marsh Arabs in Iraq, he's walked across Afghanistan, he's been in the Harvard Kennedy School, and he ends up, having been an author as well, as a Minister of State. That is the sort of person that we should listen to and be led by. But I want to tell you how I know Rory. I first met him when he was minister at DEFRA, that's a sort of code for Department of the Environment, and he then went on to be a minister at DFID, that's Department for International Development. And during that time, some of you, Joe, you were here. We held, just over the road from here, the Cecil Summit. I mentioned it earlier. And struggling to escape from Westminster, Rory devoted an hour and a half of time that should have been parliamentary time to a video link with our conference. And during that hour and a half, he spoke as I think it's safe to say no other DFID minister had ever spoken in terms of understanding about the link between development and conservation and the environment. And those of you who were in that room will remember the riotous applause that he got. So it's a pleasure for me and a privilege for us that he has yet again rushed to escape Parliament. He missed the first train, he got the second one. Goodness knows what influence he used to slow the train driver down in order to get the train, and has arrived here. He can't stay all that long, but he's very graciously said he'll say a few words about our enterprise, and I think he might even mention a few words about the enterprise that preoccupies him at the moment. But Rory, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And can I begin by saying how very, very happy I am to be here and what a huge admirer I am of David MacDonald, who came into my life, as I'm sure he's come into many of your lives, with an enormous amount of charm, ingenuity, intelligence, political savvy into my office in the Department of the Environment. And if anybody really should have been a great statesman or a politician, it is indeed this man. I think he's put himself in a strange role. He'd be a much better politician than me. Can I check briefly also that you can hear me? You can hear me clearly? Great, fantastic. I'm going to touch briefly on three things, and then maybe we could have a little bit of a chance for a conversation before I gallop for that train back to London. And they are reflecting really on the theme of your conference, which is environmental geopolitics. I'm the politics bit of the environmental geopolitics, and I wanted to try to use my own life as a minister to illustrate some of the ways in which I sense problems in the way in which our political systems work and the way in which they can or cannot deliver conservation. In particular, I'm going to touch on three little episodes, one from my time as a Foreign Office minister responsible for Africa, then a little bit from my time as an Environment Minister by looking at some of our policy around rewilding the Lake District, and finally, I'm going to bring, because I have to, because we're only 8 days away from it, the subject of Brexit, which has been consuming much of the last few months of my life. And the argument I want to make is that the problems that we face as politicians operate on three quite distinct levels. My hypothesis is that what I'm going to illustrate in relationship to South Sudan is a problem of abstraction, a problem of language distance from reality. What I'm going to try to illustrate in relationship to the Lake District and biodiversity is a problem of dishonest agendas. And what I'm going to illustrate in relation to Brexit is a problem of recalcitrance, stubbornness, right? But these three themes, abstraction, dishonesty, and recalcitrance, I think are the three themes that, for me at least, illustrate some of the problems around conservation and politics. So to start with South Sudan. South Sudan really interests me because it was, for a moment, 2005, the great last exercise in American international diplomacy. South Sudan, which had been through decades of conflict, suddenly found itself adopted towards the end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s by an extraordinary array of American figures, ranging from George Clooney on the activist end, to Billy Graham, the great evangelist, through eventually, after 9/11, people who were experts on terrorism worried about the fact that Khartoum in Sudan had provided haven for Osama bin Laden. These different factions came together sufficiently to drag in the White House, so that by 2003, a special envoy was appointed by the president. 2004, Congress voted $350 million for a Sudan Act, and by 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement had been signed, which laid the foundation in 2011 for a referendum under which the people of South Sudan voted from independence from Sudan, 99% voting for independence. And it became then one of the great childs of international intervention. Over 10,000 UN peacekeepers from 60 countries, including Bolivia, Papua New Guinea, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, were deployed onto the ground in South Sudan, followed by thousands of international civilians. By 2011, a great development plan was written for South Sudan, a over 400-page document, theoretically authored by the government of South Sudan, but in effect written by officials from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, USAID, DFID, and Norway. And through this, over $1 billion a year of international assistance poured. And the intervention was a catastrophe. And a catastrophe very, very rapidly. Within 2.5 years, the world's newest nation had collapsed into civil war. The president and the vice president had begun to try to kill each other. America lent in with all the energy and optimism still apparent in the early Obama administration. John Kerry found himself on the telephone 4 times in a week to the satellite telephones of rebel leaders in the bush, begging them to come back together to the peace table. The previous president of the United States, George W. Bush, picked up the phone to President Salva Kiir, who was wearing a Stetson hat, which he had been given by President Bush, and Salva Kiir simply hung up the phone on him and proceeded in a meeting, General Assembly of the United Nations, to call President Obama a liar and provoke the normally very patient President Obama so much that he walked out of the room. The gap in power between South Sudan and the United States at that period was perhaps greater than has ever existed in world history. When Britain was the colonial power in South Sudan, GDP per capita in Britain was approximately 6 times that of the average South Sudanese. The GDP per capita in the United States is about 68 or 70 times that of the average South Sudanese, and the total economy of the United States 6,000 times larger than that of South Sudan. The soft power of the United States and South Sudan seemed almost limitless. The tallest player in the National Basketball Association was South Sudanese. Riek Machar, John Garang had studied in the United States. They'd married American wives. They had contacts going back with the United States Congress back to the early 1980s. And yet none of this, soft power, hard power, money, Navy SEALs, presidential calls, made any difference whatsoever to the collapse of this country into civil war. In the middle of all of this, though, is the story not of impotence, right, waning American influence, but of abstraction. Because if you go to that document, that 411-page document, written by all these grandees, the foundation of the South Sudan development strategy, you discover that the very people who you could speak to of an evening over a drink in Juba, who would have told you that the government of the country, that many members of this cabinet had been personally implicated in massacres, who could tell you that $12 billion had been stolen in the previous 6 years, that none of the money had been spent on health and education, but instead found its way slightly to Kenyan bank accounts, but in a larger fashion to the purchase of prodigious quantities of oxen and the arming of young men to guard those oxen, nevertheless could turn up the following morning and write in a document about the commitment of that government to the equitable distribution of resources, towards a zero-tolerance attitude to corruption down to the most local level, to transparency, accountability, predictability. And in the entire document, there is no place. Right? In this entire document, the word Nua does not appear, the word Dinka does not appear, the word ox does not appear, the word gun does not appear. But the word accountability appears 160 times. The word governance appears 145 times. The word sustainability appears 180 times. But the word church, and it's the Catholic Church in Equatorial Province in South Sudan that actually provides most of the education and health services, appears only once. Why then is it possible for us to create this abstraction? How is it possible to write a strategy document and pour $1 billion a year through this document when everybody that's writing it knows that nothing on the ground resembles anything that they say in their document? At first I thought maybe it was naivety, ignorance. But when I talked to the officials who are writing this document, of course, they don't know very much about South Sudan, that's true. None of them has spent a single night in a South Sudanese house. Not one of them can speak a single word in Azande. Not a single one of them can speak a single word in Nua. Yes. But they know enough about the country to know that the politicians are corrupt. They know the money's gone missing. They know that things are pretty bad. So it's not exactly naivety. But nor is it cynicism. They're not lying either. It's not that they're writing this document and laughing when they write this document. It's that this document, at some profound level, does not mesh with reality at all, because it is a document talking to other documents. These words, accountability, sustainability, governance, are not drawn from South Sudan. They're drawn from the mission statements of the Department for International Development. They're drawn from the policy documents of the World Bank in Washington. Now, there could be an alternative which would involve describing what you could actually achieve in South Sudan as opposed to what you feel you ought to achieve. Right? You could imagine that you could write a document saying, we may not be able to create a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and rule of law, but we may be able to dig a drainage ditch slightly better outside the protection of civilian camp in Malakal. We may not be able to stop the militias stealing some of the food aid, but we may be able to save the lives of some babies. But that document is not written. And the reason that document is not written takes us from the question of abstraction and discourse to the question of politics. That document is not written, partly because the civil servants writing that document feel more comfortable themselves, the foreigners, writing about accountability than writing about these 620 Nua generals with their oxen. They don't know much about the Nua, they don't know much about the oxen. They know quite a lot about how to write about accountability and governance. There's a further problem. How can they say to the Treasury that gives them money, that's putting money into this project, that they have anything other than a zero-tolerance attitude to corruption down to the local level, even if they know that corruption in this country is skyrocketing and hitting record levels? How can they say to the politicians signing off on this contract that we may not be able to guarantee that the clinic you're about to build in Malakau, which incidentally was burnt down 2 years ago by the militia of the government that you're currently funding, who are probably going to burn it down again in 2 years' time, may nevertheless be worthwhile building in order to get some health care in for 24 months. And how do you say that to the public that's providing the money? You know, over £100 million of British taxpayers' money is going in every year to this country for humanitarian relief in a situation which is not a natural disaster. It's not been an earthquake, there's not been a flood. This disaster has been created by the government in Juba, right? So, in the end, people prefer, rather than getting involved in the courageous business of describing reality, facing the facts on the ground directly, to instead engage in optimism. Optimism completely unrooted in any practical steps, and in the ritual incantation of development theory. Which brings me to the Lake District, right? From South Sudan to the Lake District, right? In the Lake District, I discovered as an environment minister, the problem was not that the officials had no idea what was going on the ground, right? It's not the South Sudan problem. In fact, we know too much about the Lake District. Every single English poet has written about the Lake District for about 300 years, right? Every English writer of note has stayed in a cottage in the Lake District. The geological maps of the Lake District are amongst the greatest geological maps in the world. Our understanding of the botany of the Lake District, our understanding of the wildlife of the Lake District, our understanding of the archaeology of the Lake District is prodigious because every clergyman and scientist in the United Kingdom has been writing about the Lake District since the 1760s. Right? There's not a single acre of the Lake District that has not been described and redescribed over and over again. And into this world, the idea of rewilding appears. The concept is to come into this area, which is densely patterned with small traditional sheep farms, drive the sheep off the land, and instead allow trees to return. And the arguments are being made by people like the people in this room, and for very good reasons. Those sheep damage biodiversity, right? They chew too far down. It's been overstocked in the 1980s through European Union subsidies. And putting more trees in the Lake District will, of course, have good contributions to carbon. It may, in certain narrow areas, reduce flooding. It's suitable also for the United Utilities, the water company that owns a great deal of the Lake District, because they're not going to have to spend money on purifying their reservoirs from sheep poo, which is something that currently irritates them. There's another economic argument which they hide behind, which is that if they can get rid of these curmudgeonly sheep farmers as tenant farmers, they could instead get a better income by getting wealthy school teachers from Manchester to retire to the Lake District and buy these places as second homes. The Royal Society for Protection of Birds wants somewhere to put a new legacy they've got by getting a new sanctuary for birds, which they can get going. And above all, the rewilding movement in Britain is excited by the idea that here perhaps they can get a landscape scale rewilding and reintroduce, who knows, the lynx and the wolf in the new recreation of some primeval forest across the Lake District. Right? However, these farmers, their families have been there for nearly 1,000 years. They support the local community. It's their children that go to the local school. It's their tractors who clear the road of snow. And 11 million people a year come to see this farmed landscape. 2.2 billion pounds a year come into the local economy from tourists coming from as far away as China because they've read a Beatrix Potter book, and the Beatrix Potter book is set in a pastured landscape where they can see green sheep pasture and dry stone walls and talk to farmers who have lambs in the fields. The same tourists have no interest in seeing a rewilded landscape. We know this because similar rewilded landscapes exist just 50 miles north on the Scottish border and get almost no visitors at all. Right? There is no viable tourist income coming in from the return of this land to forest. This conflict, right, this discussion, then needs to be resolved somehow by the British government. And none of us are innocent in this. A single decision with government subsidies, £3.2 billion a year is spent in subsidies to these farmers. Right, a decision to take away the single farm payment and instead replace it with environmental subsidy could transform whether or not there were sheep or indeed farmers at all in this area. A single decision to create a forestry investment zone through the Forestry Commission could in a moment turn 5,000 acres of this land into Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce, although actually what people are talking about in terms of biodiversity would be native woodland. And the question is, how do you resolve this? Well, the answer tends to be an appeal to democracy. And an appeal to democracy is reduced to somebody standing on the top of a hillside saying to 500 visitors, here is a picture of the landscape as it is now. Here is a picture of the landscape with some more trees in it. Which do you like more, right? And 350 visitors say, we like the picture with more trees, right? The environmentalist then sees on this, and then they take it forward. But who says to the environmentalists that when you are talking about indigenous pastoral communities in Africa, you show some respect, right? If these people were the Kalahari Bushmen, you would be very sensitive in what you're about to do in turning this into a rewilded landscape. But because these people are traditional Cumbrian sheep farmers, indigenous sheep farmers in Cumbria, you show no respect at all. You say instead, these people are subsidy junkies, they're farmers, these farms are not really economically viable in the long term, they're doing a huge amount of damage to the landscape, they should simply be moved on. What sort of right have they to public money in order to continue in this area? And then a final problem is introduced. This place was listed by UNESCO as a national park, but on the basis not of its wildlife, but on the basis of its cultural heritage, on the basis of Wordsworth and the Viking farms that were contained in that Lake District. Which brings me finally to Brexit, right? So I began with the problem of abstraction in South Sudan. I pushed through the problem of what I would call dishonest discourse in relation to the Lake District and biodiversity, and I'm going to finish with the question of intransigence in Brexit. In resolving the questions of what to do with a particular place, it is very tempting to talk about democracy. So my example in the Lake District was these two pictures of a particular valley. Do you like it with more trees? Do you like it with fewer trees? And if the people say you want it with more trees, then who are we to stand in their way or to defend the rights of the Lake District farmers against the popular will? Brexit, a referendum is held. 52% of people vote to leave the European Union. How then do the same intellectuals and policymakers respond to this decision? What actually happens is then the next 2.5 years is then spent by intellectuals and policymakers predominantly saying, this was the wrong decision. We're not very interested in the fact that 52% of people voted to leave the European Union. We're now going to explain why leaving the European Union is a very, very bad idea. We're going to ask questions like, name one advantage which would come from leaving the European Union, and pointing out the economic damage that would be done through leaving the European Union. A clash of values happens. And this is very important because this clash of values is not happening in South Sudan. It's not even happening in the Lake District. It's happening in the core of British politics. In one of the most educated, connected countries on earth, right? A country where we're very close to 50% of our population going to university. Population that has never been so educated, never been so healthy, never been so well informed, where every single one of these voters is in a state that was unimaginable 60, 80 years ago. When my father was here at this college, less than 2% of the British population went to university. Right? Today, to say I am the first person from my family to go to university is no longer an interesting statement. It's simply a statistical truth. You've gone from 2% of the population to 50% of the population in 70 years. Anybody boasting they're the first person from their family to go to university is simply observing that they are the norm, right, in British society. Right? They're no longer an exception, they're the norm. And yet, in this highly educated, sophisticated country, peaceful, no civil war, huge amounts of data, a stable civil service, more information than you could possibly hope to get, we remain 6 days before we are due to leave the European Union in a situation in which Approximately half the country is determined to remain in the European Union, whatever the political cost, and approximately half the country is determined to leave the European Union, whatever the economic cost. And where the Prime Minister is trying to make an argument in the middle, right? She is trying to say, I respect the result of the referendum, so we need to leave the European Union, but I want to do it with a deal. Right? I want to do it in as measured and moderate way as possible. I want to have a close economic relationship with the European Union. I want to settle the Irish border. I want to settle citizens' rights. I want to pay the European government 37 billion, the European Union government 37 billion pounds in order to deal with our outstanding obligations. And I want to have frictionless trade in the future. And I'm entering a backstop, which is potentially de facto a permanent customs union. In other words, she's trying to compromise. Right? She's trying to say to the Remain side, I know you don't want to leave the European Union, but I'm going to leave in a way that is very close to Europe. And she's trying to say to the hard Brexit side, look, I know you voted for Brexit and I respect that, and we're leaving the Commission, we're leaving the European Parliament, but we're going to do it in a way that is gentle economically, that is measured, that is moderate, and that accepts that in the end this Brexit was a 52%, 48% vote, so we're going to do a 52%, 48% Brexit. We're going to do a soft Brexit, right? We're going to play it down the middle. And what we discover is nobody, literally nobody, is prepared to support that position. Instead, we are being pushed to the edge of a cliff in 6 days' time, where both sides, against any reason or logic, somehow believe that if they are just intransigent and refuse to vote for her deal, then in 6 days' time, each one of them is going to get exactly what they want, right? Right? The Remainers believe there is a 100% certainty that if they vote down the Prime Minister's deal, then there's going to be a second referendum, which will certainly vote for Remain, and that will certainly end up with us remaining in the European Union, and there's no reason to countenance any risk on the other side. Meanwhile, the no-deal, intransigent, hard Brexiteers believe there is a 100% certainty that if they just vote down the Prime Minister's deal on Tuesday, we're going to have a no-deal Brexit on Saturday, and we will leave the European Union with no deal at all. Meanwhile, the customs union lot somehow believe that if they just vote down the Prime Minister's deal, they can get Jeremy Corbyn's version of a deal with the European Union 100% by Friday, negotiated with the European Union, and there's nothing to be concerned about here, right? What is happening in our democratic process, right? They can't all be right. They must acknowledge that there is some element of risk here. Right? The Remainers must understand that even if they think there is a probability that they're going to be able to remain in the European Union, there is at least a non-trivial risk that they could end up with the hard no-deal Brexit. The hard no-deal Brexit people must at least accept there is a non-trivial possibility that if they vote down the Prime Minister's deal, they're going to end up remaining in the European Union and losing everything that they thought they'd had in the first place. And yet literally nobody is prepared to shift a quarter of an inch. It becomes even more interesting in the middle ground. Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit and Theresa May's Brexit are basically the same thing. Right? They are identical things. They have the same withdrawal agreement. They both end up basically in a customs union. In fact, the Labour Brexit secretary has just said it is impossible to leave the backstop, that the backstop is a customs union, and because it's impossible to leave, it's a de facto permanent customs union, but the reason he won't vote for it is he wants a permanent customs union, right? So I just wanted to finish with that, because when we talk about conservation politics, when we talk about environmental politics, when we imagine that it might be possible to go into South Sudan and resolve the problems in South Sudan in order to deal with the remaining elephant population in South Sudan, or to try to deal with the issue of the wetlands in South Sudan, or to try to deal with any of the conflicts between human and nature in South Sudan, we need to remember that in the end, not only can we not solve these problems in the Lake District, right, or we cannot solve these problems in relation to Brexit, which is one of the most fundamental, binary, overdeveloped, over-discussed, over-investigated issues in global history, right? But that it's likely to be more, not less difficult in South Sudan than it is in Westminster. And on that very optimistic political note, thank you very much indeed.
Very good. So, wonderful, as anticipated. And the icing on the cake is that Rory says that the situation of his train will enable him to answer briefly 2 quick questions. So, would somebody like to... Charles?
I don't want to talk about failed states, so I'm going to talk about South Sudan. And... Could you just say a little bit more about the implications of the very eloquent argument you made about some of the issues in aid in South Sudan? And it seems what you're saying is that one of the limitations about the effectiveness of aid is institutional issues. And as I know you know very well, Darren Asen-Klogu, that school of aid theorists, who say there is a real limitation about what we can do. What message do you take from reading that literature, from your experience in South Sudan, about what UK policy should be in aid, the 0.7% commitment, and what we should be doing as a rich, at the moment, country in global development?
Okay. So I'm going to say this with some deference. In fact, I have a philosopher sitting opposite me. But one of the problems in international politics, perhaps the most fundamental problem in international politics, or indeed international aid, lies in the relation between can and ought. So David said that one of the things that's excited him in this conversation has been the move away from simply talking about empirical evidence on a particular species towards the conversation about values, towards what we want the world to look like. In international development, the problem is the reverse. In international development, we're very good at saying what it ought to be. We're very, very bad at talking about what we can do. So in Afghanistan, it's very easy to say we want Afghanistan to commit to transparent, predictable, and accountable financial processes, right? And in saying this, we disguise from ourselves the fact that all we've done there is say what Afghanistan does not have. We haven't actually produced a plan for it. We've just said this country is corrupt, right? Saying it needs to have transparent, predictable, accountable financial processes is simply a polite insult to the country with which we're dealing. And our ways of thinking about state building, nation building, or any of the things ultimately relating to governance or power which underlie the problems that you have in conservation in any developing context rest on the mistake of assuming that these things are questions of engineering or project management. So if you look at the classic textbook, Fixing Failed States, written by a pair, Claire Lockhart and Ashraf Ghani, they suggest that in order to fix failed states, you need to begin with the mapping of internal and external stakeholders, the definition of critical tasks, the mobilization of sufficient resources measured through iterative monitoring. Now, there are a number of problems with that. One of them is that that sentence is completely incomprehensible, right? Incomprehensible not just to non-English speakers, but incomprehensible to English speakers. But stripped down, translated, what it actually says, if you listen carefully, is we need some people, we need some money, we need a plan, and we need to check what we're doing from time to time. That's the measured through iterative monitoring bit, right? In other words, what they've actually laid out is a description of how you build a garden shed or how you bake a cake, right? It doesn't tell you anything about the place in which you are located or what is feasible or not feasible within this place. It doesn't tell you anything about power. It doesn't tell you anything about the fact if you're talking about Zambia and the removal of agricultural subsidies in Zambia, it doesn't explain to you that most of the cabinet have a financial interest in those agricultural subsidies, and therefore those agricultural subsidies are not going anywhere. Right? It doesn't help you to understand why the clinic that you produce in Ethiopia with the same money and the same program in Nigeria has a completely different result. Right, so a DFID has a £21 million rural health program in Ethiopia and the Save £21 million rural health program in Nigeria. You go to visit the clinic in Ethiopia, you see 23,000 patients a year coming through the clinic, some very motivated doctors, you see some community workers reaching out and doing sexual health stuff, you see fantastic medical records. You turn up at the same clinic in a rural area in Kaduna, and there are no sheets on the beds, there are no medicines on the shelves, there's a fan, but the nearest electricity is 10 miles away, and there are no patients insane enough to go anywhere near this clinic, right? And yet, the international system continues to spend the same amount on the same program in the two places. This is insane, right? Logically, either you should say, we have a bigger problem in Nigeria, so we will spend more money in Nigeria, or we're having success in Ethiopia, we will invest in the success in Ethiopia, we'll spend more money in Ethiopia. What does not make sense is to keep doing the same thing in the two countries with completely different results and not responding in any way. Now, fortunately for me, I have to run for my train. But what I'm going to conclude with this is to say that one of the lessons of this is that often we need to think less about development and more about preservation. Now, that may mean less about developing a country, more about simply saving lives. We don't need to be ashamed about saving lives. Often I find in Somalia and South Sudan, people in humanitarian aid are ashamed. They keep saying, well, we're not addressing the root causes of this, we're just feeding these people, but we're not sorting out the fundamental economic factors here. It may not be possible for us to sort out, as foreigners, the fundamental economic or political factors in South Sudan. That doesn't mean that you don't want to still be preserving lives. We may also want to advocate and preserve human rights and the rights of minority groups, Yazidis in northern Syria, Christians in Pakistan, minority groups, for example, in other countries in Africa. We may want to, even in difficult situations, preserve cultural heritage. It may make sense. One of the things I've been involved in is saving historic buildings and historic areas from Mali to Yemen, even in the middle of a developmental crisis, because these things will matter for 100 and 200 years to come. And most importantly of all, in terms of the discussion we're having tonight, it may make an enormous amount of sense to invest in conservation on the basic theory that these things that you're dealing with are deeply, deeply precious. And we may actually, as development agencies, be better at stopping people being killed, stopping areas being eliminated, than we are at the development part of transforming things into the future. And on that slightly pessimistic, but I hope realistic note, which is really a note in favor of everything that you are doing in terms of conservation and politics, I want to thank you very much and run for my train. Good night.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we really will run for the train now. I just want to say three remarkable things. A constellation has been coming together. We've had a remarkable speaker. We're in a remarkable city that draws people to it in a really remarkably beautiful college. And the intersection of those things, slightly poignantly, but I think movingly and interestingly, is that as we arrived here, came into the dining room, you'll notice that just outside the door there's a memorial engraving on the wall. Look at the bottom of the list of names, because Rory says, that's my uncle. So there we are. So it's a rounded evening.